Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daniels on Research. I'm David Daniel.
I'm Daniel Willingham. This is the podcast where David and I find a new article every week or two and bring it to you to talk about what it might mean for education
Right. And what implications it has in general
in general.
today. Right.
Right.
Um,
Very general
so
tonight.
we both found the same article and sent it to each other. And so that's kind of interesting. What's the article?
The article, well, I'm glad you asked because I don't have the title ready. The title is Cognitive and Academic Benefits of Music Training with Children, a Multi-Level Meta-Analysis.
It's an interesting topic. There's several related topics, but what they were looking at is, does training in music have implications for other things?
Right.
And we assume that we talk about that all the time, how important music training or something else, doesn't have to be music, training in this helps with that.
Right.
Thorndike was a big, for you psych people, Thorndike was big into this with Latin training, in learning this language would help you in all this other stuff. And it's been really elusive and hard to find, yet we still keep talking about it. We talk about it with Lumosity, where you're going to learn this game and that's going to transfer into gains in other places, and we haven't been able to find it. But music's a big one. So what did they find? What do you want to talk about?
Yeah. So, well, let's briefly talk. We agreed we weren't going to get too much into the detail because the punchline on this experiment is, I shouldn't say experiment, the punchline on this analysis is fairly straightforward. But we start with the finding that there is this really robust correlation between musical training and success in academics. So whether you're measuring attention or whether you're measuring memory or whether you're measuring success in school more generally, people who have studied a musical instrument are better at those measures than people who have not studied a musical instrument. Now, people who listen to this podcast, of course, are familiar with the idea that correlation is not causation. And so there's a very ready alternative explanation, namely that if you're pretty smart, then maybe you're the kind of person who obviously does well in school anyway. And then also you are more likely to be the kind of person who will take up a musical instrument. So they wanted to, people are of course aware of that. So the way to address that concern is to take people who haven't studied a musical instrument yet and then conduct an experiment where half of the people are trained in playing some musical instrument and half are not. And you look for cognitive change as a consequence of the training. So they found, I think it was 54 studies that fit that description. And they were fairly careful. One of the important features was an active control group, and we'll get back to that in a second. But the upshot here is that when the study was done correctly, and the correct study was the active control group bit, there was just no effect at all on cognition of musical training. So we see that correlation, and we said, there's an alternative explanation, and the alternative explanation turned out to be the one that seems more likely to be right, because when you do the experiment, you get no benefit of training.
All right, so let's summarize all of that. So it's a meta-analysis study.
Yeah.
And we'll give you all the caveats of a meta-analysis. So we don't want to get into are meta-analyses good or bad or anything like that. This is something that was done, peer-reviewed, published, and it's something we can talk about.
Right.
They created a criteria, which ones were going to be included, which ones weren't, which we're going to talk about in a second. And based on all of the studies they could find that met their criteria, they concluded there actually wasn't much evidence to conclude that training in music transferred to other cognitive skills.
Right.
Okay, so that's powerful right there. So for those of you watching, think about what I just said. I just said there's a study of studies out there that shows no transfer from musical training to anything else. Now, first off, let's say this: there's music in your background.
Yeah.
So there's actual music training going on in your house right now.
Yes. And now I'm crushed. I should run into the other room and tell my daughter, there's no reason to study piano anymore because it's not going to make you smarter.
Right. So let's point out studying piano might be really good for learning how to play the piano and loving playing the piano.
Right.
All right. So what this study is talking about is, does it confer other, maybe not so easily related benefits besides just being good at music and enjoying and loving music?
Exactly. So there's a couple of things to get into here. One is we want to talk more about transfer. The other is should now kids not study music? But I do want to return to this point that I briefly mentioned, and then you highlighted as well, about which studies were included and which were not. Because if you look overall at all of the studies, you maybe see a little bit of an effect, and you'd have to squint. But there may be an effect. But once you separate out in a principled way the studies that were done really well versus the studies that maybe had some problems, it's only the studies that have problems seem to show an effect. And the big problem they identify is whether or not there's an active control group. So an active control group, kids, is where you don't just say, like, some people are going to learn to play the violin and some are not. The are not people differ not only in the whether the musical training, they also differ in knowing that something is being done to them from which they might benefit.
Well,
So
even
maybe
if they don't know that, they suffer from not having time on task doing something else.
they're right. They're not mentally engaged, or so active control group means you're actually going to give these people something to do, some sort of a training or something, but it's not anything that you would ever predict would influence your outcome measure.
So
In this case, these cognitive measures.
let me say that in a different way, because you said it really well, but I want to be part of this podcast. Something versus nothing. Something usually works.
Yeah.
Right. So at best we can show that something does no harm in a study like that, but we can't really talk about, because most teachers don't do nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really not that helpful beyond do no harm.
Right. Right.
So something versus something. Well, now, that's important. That's why the placebo group, you actually give them a pill, it may be inert, but they're going through the same motions, they're going through the same sorts of things. The only thing we want to differ is the actual treatment, not the things correlated with the treatment, like all the time on task, time practicing, maybe other sorts of things that you would get maybe some benefits for just concentrating.
You might get benefits from concentrating, and then especially for the types of measures they were using here, the belief that what you're doing might benefit you turns out to be really important. They've seen this in some of the working memory studies, and it's probably a motivation effect. So we do know from other work that if you motivate people, like if you offer them money or you give them some sort of basically a false belief so that they think, oh, I'm actually like a pretty smart person. I want to show how smart I am on this cognitive test. People do a lot better. So there's this impression that these cognitive tests like IQ tests are really pure and they're tapping into some essence of you, but they're actually really subject to motivational effects. So that's important for the active control group, because if I do something and tell you, hey, you have some reason to believe this is going to make you smarter, then in a way you kind of want to show that it really worked. And so you try harder after you've had the treatment than maybe you did the first time around.
Which is kind of in psychology, that's the kind of the definition of a placebo effect.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
So their inclusion criteria tried to take that out and looked at ones that gave a comparison with something that was similar enough in core, taking up time and other sorts of things where a really good comparison can be made. And they couldn't find it.
And there you go. So now, and you alluded to this. I mean, let's review a little more systematically. I was thinking as you were saying it about other instances in the history of education or just American culture more broadly, where people have tried this, where like, let's make people smarter by having them do thus and so. So you mentioned studying Latin, which was really common in American schooling. Nobody wanted kids, really common in American schooling up to about 1900, 1910, something like that. And it's not like people didn't know it was a dead language. There was this belief that there was going to be transfer because the grammar of Latin was very orderly. It was thought to be very logical. So the idea was that there would be this habit of mind that would be developed by thinking logically about Latin. You would think logically about other things. And as you pointed out, Thorndike, this was one of the great successes of educational psychology. Thorndike showed that it doesn't work that way. Kids who take Latin don't think anymore
He
successful.
grudgingly showed that. That was like, but Thorndike wanted that to be so true.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Damn science.
Yeah, damn. Well, yeah, there's many a wonderful theory that's been slayed by data.
Yeah.
So what other instances come to mind for things that people have hoped would yield this broad transfer?
Oh, basically art,
Art, yeah,
right? All general education programs in every college in the whole wide world.
yeah.
Just a small one, right? Do you have any you can think of?
There's there's a lot. We'll come back to Gen Ed in a minute because you can. I think there's an alternative way of thinking about that might be fruitful. Computer programming is the big one that I was
Oh, and
thinking.
coding.
Coding, yeah, coding
Yeah.
started. That started in the '60s. It sort of had its heyday. There's actually some reason to be slightly more optimistic about coding. There was again a meta-analysis. I've forgotten when, several years ago that showed there was some positive transfer for coding on things that kind of looked like coding tasks. So some transfer, I think, to mathematics, possibly to some basic spatial tests. The other one is chess that I thought of. The
Oh yeah.
idea that, right, getting elementary school kids to play chess because this is going to make them think more logically. So this does seem to be kind of a perennial hope that never really maps out.
Well, even for parents, we want to train. We can't train on every possible instance. We're hoping that good exemplars would make it so they could take a lesson from here and put it over there.
Right.
You know.
Now, what about, I mean, you and I were talking about this a little bit before we started. And you brought up the idea that maybe that we're not really using the right measures. So here's my daughter playing the piano in the next room. What if I thought, okay, I know she's not going to be better at math from playing piano, but like I like the discipline. I like the idea that, she knows she has to practice and it makes her like more organized in her schedule. Or what if I said it's a self-esteem thing? I mean, it makes her feel better about herself, like a more well-rounded person or something. Do you feel like that's possible, or do you think that's kind of,
No, I
there's no
totally.
evidence there's no evidence for it? Do you think it's plausible, or what do you think about that?
No, my lament was that people hadn't been looking at that.
Yeah.
It's a completely open empirical question. That learning for let's go specific skills, right? For example, you talk about organization, maybe those sorts of things, discipline, right? I don't know why people haven't looked at that yet. There's keep looking at cognitive skills, but everything is interconnected to some degree, right? So imagine cognition without emotion. You never use without motivation. You would never use your cognition.
Yeah.
Right. You have to point it someplace and want to point it someplace. So of course we should be looking at these other sorts of things. I think music is a great example of something that makes you feel accomplished. Think about it. When you play the song the right way, you played the song the right way. When you hear yourself in tune, you're in tune. You get feedback right away. If you're being a good learner. You persevere through that, and you
Yeah.
learn how to progress it iteratively or through inspiration and very suddenly. There's lots of benefits that come from music that may make their way into a template for who am I as a learner.
I mean, I wonder if just in answer to your question, like, why are they not looking at these things? Part of it's got to be that people are fearful about the measurement problem, that these are things that are pretty hard to measure. And you're guessing it for many kids, it's going to be a subtle effect. And so you're worried it's all just going to kind of wash out and you won't see it.
Well,
I
plus
mean,
there's large individual difference issues there. For example, rhythmicity,
right.
in terms of being organized and all those sorts of things. People might think it's too complex to look at those things. There's too many pre-existing variables. Whereas someone who doesn't play music, then they can. It's more cut and dry.
Yeah, I mean, the individual differences may be really crucial in terms of interaction of how kids interact with these lessons. So put it another way, for many kids, music doesn't do anything for them and it's a drag, and and the parents don't handle it that well because they nag their kids and so on. But for some subset of kids, it does have a big outsize effect. And I think you and I were talking about this the other day. I mean, that, what are the reasons to have a music program in school? One of the reasons to have a music program in school is that for some kids, music is going to be a huge deal for them. And that's going to be a reason for them to stay in school potentially. Like,
Yeah,
they're
that
like,
kept me going. There's no doubt. I played an instrument from, well, actually, I, my great grandmother raised me until fourth grade. She made me play the accordion. I'm kind of, it's a shameful past, but I used to play along with Lawrence Welk show when I was little, like a little monkey. But the interesting thing for me is I was in music pretty much all the time I was in school, and that was sometimes the only reason why I went to school.
yeah,
And it's definitely, and we were talking about this before, I would have actually never graduated high school had I not been playing in the band and playing music.
yeah,
And so there's a lot that it has to do with in terms of my sense of who I am, my really to master new things, impact things, a lot of really cool things that can be looked at as being ramifications of being trained in music,
yeah,
not just
yeah,
cognitive skills. And by the way, there could be cognitive skills, we just haven't found a way to get to them yet. Or are they're complex and interactive with other sorts of skills. For example, identity as a learner.
right, right. Self-image. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like telling the high school story or nah?
Oh, sure. I was in band, and you have jazz band and pep band and marching band and all that. So I have lots of credits for band. My my About my third year of high school, I decided I was going to drop out. I was 16. I could drive. I loved to surf. And I decided I was going to quit school, learn how to fix cars so I could work at night and surf all day. And
You got a plan.
yeah, that actually is a plan, by the way.
Yeah.
So and there was a learning component.
It's
So I
not
didn't know.
unrealistic either.
No, I didn't know anything about fixing cars at all. It seemed like something you could do at night.
How hard could it be? Yeah.
I went into my counselor's office to told him. He basically said, "You're nothing but a thug. I didn't expect to see you graduate from here anyway," and sent me on my way. On my way out, the secretary grabbed me by the arm and said, David, while you were talking in there, I looked at your transcripts. You get really good grades, and you have lots of credits because you're in band. If you just took these extra classes next semester, you could graduate in 3 years and leave here with a degree." And I was 16. I graduated when I was 16. I started college when I was 16. I only applied to one college, by the way. But yeah, if it wasn't for having those credits, being engaged in band, and having a reason even to go to school some days, I never would have even graduated high school.
And the other thing that I wanted to say, first of all, it's a great story, and it, of course, beautifully illustrates what we were talking about. That music can have an outsized effect for some kids, and I think most people would agree that not everything we offer in school has to have an effect on every kid. I mean, it certainly didn't for me. I was in band in 7th and 8th grade because it was required. I played trombone. It was a complete disaster. I mean, it's just I had no concept of the instrument whatsoever. But to me, that's fine. Like I feel like everybody should do some music. Everybody should do some visual art. Everybody should do some dancing, and not just because everybody should be exposed to it, be a well-rounded individual. That's part of what we're doing at school. I do believe that. But in addition, I love the idea that for some kids, this is going to be a really, really big deal. And I think that's part of school too, is to provide opportunities for exposure to those sorts of experiences for kids who may or may not get them at home.
Yeah, and if you take something that David Rose talks about sometimes, where kids can read if you give them something that they like to read. Right. So you give them something boring, they're not motivated. A lot of kids who have some sort of disabilities, that really kind of throws them. You give them something similarly complex, but for example, something in sports or something in something that they're really interested in, they'll put the hard work into mastering that in a
Right.
way they wouldn't have with something a little more esoteric. And music can be that for some students more broadly. It can be the thing that gets them motivated to do the other things. For example, if my GPA went too low, I couldn't be in band.
Right.
My GPA never even got close.
Right. Right. I want to return to this point you said when you mentioned gen ed, and um, and the transfer problem. And the other way of conceptualizing the transfer problem is the fact that school does make you smarter more broadly. So there's lots and lots of effects that have contributed to this idea. And smarter in this case is defined fairly narrowly. It's defined in terms of IQ. And again, that's a measurement issue. It's easy to measure. But there are lots of different paradigms showing that going to school increases your IQ. So for example, researchers have looked at instances where kids have had to miss a year of school for some accidental reason. Other paradigms, they'll look at jurisdictions where the minimum age at which you're allowed to drop out of school is increased. And they look over broad populations, the consequences of that for IQ. Each of these different types of research has problems with it, but overall you get the problems aren't always the same. And overall you get a pretty clear picture. There was a wonderful review article by Stuart Ritchie and Elliot Tucker-Drobe a couple of years ago, and they put all of this together, and they estimated each year of school increases IQ between maybe 1 and 5 points.
So let me ask you the question that's on all of our listeners slash watchers' minds. Is that because school trains you specifically in the skills that are important on an IQ test?
Oh, it certainly is. Yeah, I mean, because IQ was initially developed to predict who's going to do well in school.
Thank you, Mr. Benet.
Yeah, so there, thank you, Mr. Benet, right? So there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's also true that the types of stuff that you do well on at school are predictive of success in a broad array of careers. It's also predictive of economic success, predictive of your income. So the IQ is not a complete measure, but it's also nothing to sniff at.
So that's another interesting thing to think about, I mean, from my perspective, because what you're saying is there's some transfer going on.
Yeah,
There's something
exactly.
there. We're not finding the right way to measure it right now, but there's obviously something going on there that's transferring, maybe not across domains, but maybe beneath domains, right?
I think it could be beneath domains. I think there's an alternative hypothesis. So one hypothesis, as you say, is there is something quite broad that's being acquired at school and it transfers to other things. The other possibility is you're just building up a larger and larger set of narrow knowledge and narrow skills. And so it increases the probability that the IQ test that's administered happens to tap into some of that narrow knowledge and narrow skills. So you still have the same transfer issue that you always had. It's just it's hidden by virtue of the way schooling and IQ tests work.
So basically, school gives you more arrows in the quiver.
Yeah.
So, and that would be a really strong argument for general education.
Exactly.
Which is very, very relieving, by the way, Dan, because I'm actually one of the coordinators for general education here.
Well,
so.
I wasn't going to accuse you of that, but since you've admitted it, that's right.
Well, you gotta look at stuff. So
it is. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you got to be self-critical. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Anything else on your mind regarding this article or transfer?
No. So I actually, if there is, I lied. I want to close it up by talking about two things. First, I want to talk about transfer. Then I want to talk about music.
Okay.
At first, what are we saying here? Are we saying there's no transfer? We're saying the same thing we said with learning styles and everything else. So far, if you control for the experiments, we don't see it.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you're not seeing something in your students as a benefit from music. All right. So it's very different how we're going to study things and how we're going to operationally define them and zero in on them to make specific relationships between things in science, as opposed to a general orientation toward learning, a change in demeanor, other sorts of things that teachers might see a kid just brighten up when they're in music training.
Right.
So we don't want to say there's no benefit to it and there's no transfer. What we're saying is, given the well-controlled studies that we've come across, especially in this meta-analysis, it's not apparent.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
It doesn't mean it won't be.
Yeah. I hope it's plain that we're both, boosters of the idea that children should learn how to play a musical instrument. I mean, you spoke, about your own experiences. I mentioned my child is in the next room studying piano. So yeah, we'll put us on record as pro music.
Yeah, and by the way, there is transfer within music. For example, I learned how to play jazz, and I actually can really, really do a good job keeping time with rap and other sorts of things, right? So,
Really?
one of the big benefits for me from music training was, guess what? I really like music, and I really enjoy music, and I can see through music in a way that people who don't have music training don't. For how things interrelate, how these things have to go together. I don't just there how the rhythm and all those sorts of things have to work together to make a song, not just the lead vocals, for example.
Right.
There's a lot of really neat things that make your life better with music training.
Right.
And transfer be damned. I
Right.
don't If there's no transfer at all, it's valuable
Right.
for a lot of people. And that's the one thing we can't leave out.
Absolutely. Well said.
Okay, that was my thought. That was
Okay.
it.
Good. Well, let's leave it there. That's a good thought to end on.
All right, folks. Have a great one. Talk to you later,
Thanks for
Dan.
listening. See you next time.